Wow. So it is perhaps appropriate that on Thomas Jefferson's birthday, we bring to you one of our most prestigious speakers and one of Jefferson's cleverest biographers. Professor Annette Gordon-Reed is the one who definitively cracked the case, as our speaker on Tuesday might have said, on one of American history's most complex and now expunged, until now, expunged stories, which is the relationship between the Jeffersons and the Hemmingses. Professor Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Science at Harvard University. She has a jaw-dropping list of honors. I will read you a few. A fellowship from the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a MacArthur Fellowship, the National Humanities Medal, and the Woman of Power and Influence Award from the National Organization for Women in New York City. She's written extensively on both seen and unseen Americans, including a biography of Andrew Johnson, and her most recent book, out in paperback today, is Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. So when it comes to Jefferson, as I said earlier, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Gordon-Reed here, for no one knows the public and private Jefferson quite as well as she does. The story of the relationship between our third president and his own slave is one she first explored back in 1997 with her book Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. She came to the subject again more than a decade later with her 2009 book, The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, which won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize for History. And it's this book and this subject that bring us together tonight. And it's an important topic, and for some, an uncomfortable topic, to be sure. As the historian Joseph Ellis said, quote, Thomas Jefferson is often described his slaves at Monticello as my family. Annette Gordon-Reed has taken that description seriously. Surely more than Jefferson ever intended. It is not a pretty story, but it is poignant beyond belief. It is indeed, and it is also wonderfully and touchingly told. But then those of us who know her and her work would expect nothing less. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to Great Lives, the wonderful Annette Gordon-Reed.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I was in Charlottesville earlier today for the presentation of the Thomas Jefferson medals. One of my dear friends, Loretta Lynch, the former Attorney General, received the Medal for Law, and so I stopped off in Charlottesville to be able to see that and sat in that wonderful building, the Rotunda, that has been redone and is absolutely beautiful. And then I got in a car and I came here to be with you today, and I'm very, very happy to be here on a beautiful day, spring day, and been able to enjoy the hospitality of people here and the beautiful, beautiful campus. This is interesting for me because I'm sort of in the middle of a book tour with my co-author, Peter Onuf, who helped me write Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. And we've been going around together, so it's flying solo is interesting. I was used to doing it before, but I've gotten used to having him here. But tonight is a Hemings story night, and I'm glad to talk to you about this. My first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, I thought was really about historians, about the way people wrote history, and particularly the way historians had handled the story about whether or not Thomas Jefferson had had children with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, who lived on his plantation, Monticello. I was concerned about the practice of listening to the stories of the white family, the legal white family, upper class people, and dismissing the story of enslaved people who talked about their life in slavery, about something that was, as we know now, from the family stories of African Americans, and as we know now from DNA testing. I'm not talking about Hemings testing, but testing that population geneticists have done on African Americans across the country, and it pretty shows very much that the kind of mixing that was going on at Monticello was going on across the South. And this was not something that was rare, and it was not something that people talked about in their letters, but we could see it visibly in the faces and the bodies and the contour, the hair of African Americans all over the United States. So I was concerned about the way of dismissing the story of African Americans and crediting the story of the legal family. And after my book came out in 1997 and the DNA testing followed in 1998 that corroborated, supported what it was that I was suggesting in my first book, it occurred to me that one of the reasons that it was easy to dismiss the story of the Hemings family was because people didn't know anything about the Hemings family, other than that there was a scandal, and they knew the name Sally Hemings, and they may have known the name James Hemings of her brother, who was the chef, but by and large, people didn't know that much about the family. And I was thinking that if I could tell their story in a way that made people feel that they had a stake in them, that it might give people pause in the future about dismissing the story of enslaved people. I live in Manhattan, and I live partly in Manhattan, partly in Cambridge, but when I'm in Manhattan, it's a big city, crowded city, and sort of an anonymous city. But when you meet somebody, if I meet somebody in the neighborhood, I immediately begin to see them after that. You know, when you're introduced to someone, you see them all the time. You've been walking past them before, but you didn't know them. Once you begin to know them, you notice their children, you notice when you don't see them where you expect to see them, they become a part of you in a way. You have a stake in them, and that's what I wanted to do with the Hemings family, was to try to give people a stake in this family. Now, this is an interesting time to be thinking about this, because you may have seen an article in the Washington Post not long ago that talked about the fact that Monticello now is redoing the rooms where they think Sally Hemings may have lived. If you've been to Monticello, you know that, or any kind of public museum like that, it has to pick a particular moment in history to show, because they can't show the entire range of 50 years worth of development of Monticello. But this is an area where they think Sally Hemings lived. And the story appeared in the Washington Post, as I said, and it got a lot of attention. And I think the tour that they're going to be doing will get a lot of attention now, because she's there, but not like really there. The idea of actually having the room and having it part of a tour and interpreting that, I think is probably going to cause, a lot of talk. Controversy talk, and that's what you want. That's what a museum is supposed to be, an educational experience, and you have to have talk and controversy and discussion in order to do it. That's what you want. But I thought that when I was thinking about writing this book, that I wanted to do something other than just focus on Sally Hemings. And in fact, I was adamant that I was not going to talk that much about her, which of course is crazy, because she's the pivotal part of the story, right? Obviously, the family, we know the family because of the scandal, because of the story about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. So it was unrealistic for me to think that I wasn't going to leave her out, but I wanted to de-emphasize her. And then I realized that didn't make any sense. That I had to be realistic about this and understand the sort of pivotal role that she played in her family, and try to see the Hemingses not just through her, just as her, but see her as part of a web of relationships that made the story of Monticello how it made sense. Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings don't make sense just as the two people. They are a part of, as I said, a web of relationships. His relationships with her brothers, with her mother, with her sisters, it flows together if you think about it. And when I was working on the book, my first book, I was a little puzzled by Sally Hemings. I was doing sort of my own version of a book tour then, and people would always ask me about her and say, well, she was in Paris with Jefferson and his daughters and her brother, and at one point when he's about to come home, the story is told that she did not want to return with him because she did not want to be re-enslaved, and she didn't want her children to be enslaved. And the question, and Jefferson, according to Madison Hemmings's story, Jefferson promised her if she came back home with him that she would have a good life at Monticello and that her children would be freed at 21. Now, in France, there was a possibility of becoming a free person. Every person who filed a petition for freedom in Paris at this time had the petition granted. So there was a good chance that she and her brother could have remained in Paris as free people. It would have been difficult, but people who ran away through swamps and all kinds of hardships in the United States had a difficult time too when they ran away. So the fact that it was difficult did not mean that it would have been impossible or that she, was crazy to think that this is something that she could do. But I was puzzled, and people always asked me when I went around to give talks, why did she come back? Why would she come back to the United States when she had a chance to be a free person? Why would she not try to get away from the Jefferson family? And people had some ambivalent feelings about her, and I have to admit I had ambivalent feelings about her as well. But when I was working on the first book, and because I was thinking mainly about historians and what they had written, it wasn't focusing as much on the Hemmings family story. I was writing about this controversy. When I decided to write the book about the Hemmingses as a family, and I began to flesh out the individuals, their particular role in the family, how they saw themselves, how she saw herself, apparently, within this web of relationships, it began to make sense to me. She began to make much more sense to me. A 16-year-old girl who has a chance to be a free person, but would be in a foreign country. We think her brother, James, who was about 7 years older than she, would have been there for support as well, but she would have left a family behind. She would have left a mother, sisters. And if you think about the way women are today, and even more then, certainly, socialized to think about family, responsibilities to family, then it makes sense to me. It made much more sense to me why she would think that she should come back to the United States. The other thing that is said in Madison Hemings' recollections, who talks about his mother in France, he says that she implicitly trusted Jefferson, and that was the one, even more so than not coming back, that was the one that really gave me pause. Because the question would be, and why would you do that? I mean, I would construct him as her enemy and see him that way from my position writing in 1996, 1997, when I was working on this book, on my first book, and looking at Sally Hemings and kind of judging her. Implicitly trusting him seemed a dubious proposition to me. But then, working on the Hemingses of Monticello and seeing the family as a whole and thinking about them as a whole, learning about how Jefferson dealt with them and how they dealt with him, learning how he took this family and made them in some ways different than other enslaved people. They were not free. They were still enslaved, but he treated them differently from other people. And I, looking back as a historian, can say, all of those perks, all of those things that you think are favors or whatever, you're still an enslaved person. And they knew that. But if you imagine yourself in that circumstance, how difficult it would be, or how it could affect you if someone was treating you in a different way, was telling you, in a sense, that you're different than those other people who have the same legal status as you, but are being treated very, very differently, it might affect the way you feel. I mean, one of the things about being a scholar of slavery, and you're looking at this situation, it's so hard to imagine being in that position. But you have to remember as well that you're dealing with people who are human beings. You're dealing with human beings who are strong in some ways and who are weak in other ways. Every kind of personality that exists among whites during that time period or now or whatever existed within the enslaved community. The system of slavery was the overlay of their lives, but they were individuals with their own personalities, their own quirks, their own strengths, and their own weaknesses that played out within the context of this system. So once I began to think about the Hemings family as a group and understanding how Jefferson handled them, how in a way, I don't want to use the word co-opt because that's judgmental. It's very, very easy for me from the safety of now to talk about or perhaps criticize people for the way they try to make the best deals that they can for their lives in this really, really oppressive system. I mean, I have the luxury of making that kind of judgment, but I don't want to do it because I don't think it's fair. The thing is to try to do, that I was trying to do, was to try to think about this family as human beings within the context of this particular system. So I had to start at the beginning, talking about the matriarch of the Hemings family, Elizabeth Hemings, who was the daughter of an Englishman and a woman who was African. She may have actually been from Africa, or her parents could have been African, and she was born in Virginia. Elizabeth is therefore mixed race. She was owned by a family, the Epps family, an old family in Virginia, and a man named John Wales married into the Epps family, had a daughter with Martha Epps, and who died a couple of weeks after her daughter was born. He married twice after that, lost those two wives, and at some point took Elizabeth Hemings as a concubine. Now, Madison Hemings was a man who gave his recollections about his life at Monticello in 1873, and he said that he was the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and he's telling the story of his family and of his grandmother. She became the concubine of John Wales and had 6 children by him. And the youngest of those children was Sarah. And Sarah was Sally. The nickname Sally was given to her. I guess Sally is the nickname for Sarah. And John Wales has these 6 children. His daughter with Martha Epps, who is also named Martha. That's one of the tough things about this book. They're all named Martha and Mary and Polly and Patsy, and I have a family tree in it that I have to keep consulting to figure out who is whom in here. But Martha grows up and she marries Thomas Jefferson. When John Wales dies, the Hemings family and 135 other enslaved people come under the ownership of of Martha and Thomas Jefferson. As the husband, the Blackstone quote, when there's marriage, the husband and wife become one, and the one is him, is the man. He is in control of this particular family and land. They bring the Hemings children to Monticello and install the women as the sort of favored house servants of Martha. The men, the boys, they're actually boys, become servants to Jefferson. Jefferson had a manservant, a man named Jupiter, we believe his last name was Evans, who had served him or had been with him from the time he was a little boy. Jefferson moves him out of that position and makes Robert Hemings, Sally Hemings' eldest, Wales brother, his manservant. Robert is 12 at the time. He's got to figure out what kind of manservant he could have been at age 12. He travels with Jefferson. He's with Jefferson in Philadelphia when he writes the Declaration of Independence. So you get a sense of this family melding together, not just Jefferson and his wife, Martha, but Martha's enslaved half-siblings. Now, we don't know very much about Martha Wales Jefferson. The letters between Jefferson and his wife were destroyed. We think he destroyed them. Even as an older man, he was writing people letters, asking them if they had any of her letters so they could take them and destroy them. This was not uncommon among married couples because they didn't think that people should know about the intimacies of their relationship. We don't know that very much about her, but it is sort of an interesting thing that she brought her brothers and sisters to live with her at Monticello and had them in her life on a daily basis. A lot of times in the slave society, when the master or his sons or whatever had children with enslaved women, the women of the household were really pretty ticked off about that, and sometimes would make them sell the family members, would be cruel to members of the family. They'd put them away somewhere. But it's interesting that she brought them with her and brought them and put them in the house. So she's around these women and Elizabeth, who comes as well, on a daily basis. So she was not averse to having them around. When she dies in 1782, they are around her deathbed with her legal sisters, white sisters and sister-in-law, and Jefferson. And they are the ones who tell the story about Martha asking Thomas Jefferson not to remarry. And she says, their story was that she said that she did not want another woman over her children. It wasn't like, I want Thomas, I want you even in death or whatever, anything like that. It was, she may have had some difficulty with her stepmothers, and she, according to this story, did not want her children to have those problems. And he promised that he would not marry again, and he never did. She died when he's 39 years old. He dies when he's 83, and he never remarried. So after her death, Jefferson is shattered. He decides to take a mission to Paris that had been offered to him, and he takes James Hemings, who was another person in the story, another person in the family who many people who read the book say that he is their favorite member of the family. Jefferson takes him to Paris to learn how to become a chef. Jefferson loved French cooking, and he wanted a French chef for Monticello, and James was going to fit the bill. He goes to Paris with James and his eldest daughter, Martha, another Martha in this story, and they're there, just the three of them, for a few years until Jefferson makes the request that a younger daughter that he has left behind be brought to him in Paris. And he asks that his daughter, Mary, be accompanied by, he said, a careful Negro woman, such as Isabel. And who he's talking about is Isabel Hearn, who was about 28 years old. Instead, Jefferson's sister-in-law, who in this convoluted story was actually Sally Hemings' half-sister too, because she was Jefferson's wife's sister. And so she is the aunt of the girl that she is taking care of. Follow this along. Instead, they send Sally Hemings. And Sally Hemings is 14 at this time, and she is the guardian or the companion of a 9-year-old girl. She's supposed to be the babysitter for the 9-year-old girl. They arrive in London. Abigail Adams, who is there to greet them, is aghast. She basically says, you got a kid looking after another kid. She's very, very upset about this. They go on to Paris, and at some point, and we don't know when, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings begin, and here's the difficulty, and that the Washington Post article, one of the things that got people really, really, really upset was that they used the word relationship. Because what are we describing here? In a situation where a person is enslaved and presumably can't say no, not presumably, actually cannot refuse consent, do you call that a relationship? And we can talk about that afterwards when you ask me questions. But it's difficult to know how to describe it. because we're not talking about a situation where they had sex and had a kid and that's it. What we're talking about is a situation that starts at some point in the end of the 1780s and ends when he dies in 1826. So we're talking about 38 years of whatever this is. And how do you discuss this? How do you handle this particular question? And I try to handle it in the book, and that's why the book is so long, because there's no easy answer. To me, there's no easy answer. There are people who take the position that any sex between a master and an enslaved woman is rape, because we don't know that the woman could refuse consent. But then you have the situation of Sally Hemings's sister, an older sister, not a Wales sister. Sally Hemings had some half-brothers and sisters as well, who lives with a man on Main Street in Charlottesville when Jefferson is away in France. And when Jefferson comes back, she asks to be sold to this man, who becomes her legal owner. They live in this house. They have children. And when he dies, he leaves them property. And he frees his children. He never frees the woman. He frees the children. But presumably she has control over the house, which is sort of an interesting question. How does an enslaved person, how are they given control of the house? But which tells you how law operates. There's law in the books, and there's law on the ground. And as long as the community acts like that she is the owner, as long as the community acts as if she is, they refer to her in later years as his common law wife. Well, of course, she couldn't have been his common law wife because she couldn't have been his legal wife. I mean, she was enslaved. So what do you say about that situation? So I look at Sally's situation, I look at Mary's situation, and I also talk about a woman named Celia, who's not from Charlottesville, but she's from Missouri, and she was an enslaved woman who killed her master after years of sexual abuse. He comes to the house and, to have sex with her, and she refuses, and she hits him over the head, kills him, takes his body, burns it up in her fireplace, and then the next morning asks his grandson, she says, I have a lot of ashes in my fireplace. Would you help me clean it out? And unbeknownst to him, this kid goes, and he's basically, throwing his grandfather's ashes out back in the woods. Now, Celia, of course, gets in trouble. Celia is, she's tried for this, and strangely enough, many of the white people in the community were sympathetic to her. They broke her out of jail because they knew about the way he had been abusing her, but she's brought back, and eventually, of course, she's executed. But you look at these three situations. There's Mary. Is there a difference between sell me to this person so I can live with him and have children, and I'm going to hit you over the head and kill you and burn you up in a fire? And I mean, are the qualities of those two women's lives exactly the same? It strikes me that they're not. I mean, I can want to make a statement about slavery and make a statement about the rape that happened to, I think, most enslaved women's, the more common situation was Celia than Mary, obviously. But if I'm writing about Mary, I can't, in order to make, to my mind, a political point, act as if I don't notice the difference between those two situations. Now, what about Sally Hemings? Is she closer to Celia, or is she closer to Mary? And we're not going to have an answer to that because Jefferson didn't write about this. Unlike Celia's story, who gets told because she enters the legal world, there's a case, and people are describing what happened. We don't know what Sally Hemings felt about this. The only action that we know that she took was that she decided to come back with him. And she did, but once she gets here, she is completely here, that is to say Virginia, she's completely under his control. And if at some point she didn't want to, take care, her job was to take care of his rooms and his wardrobe, essentially, and to sew and to look after her children. That's basically what she did. If she didn't want to have anything to do with him, she couldn't say no anymore. People have pointed out to me that Jefferson's wife couldn't have said no either once they got married, because there was no such thing as marital rape, rules against marital rape until well into the 20th century. But he could not sell his wife. And he could have sold Sally Hemings, and he could have sold her children or their children. Now, he didn't do that. And the children left Monticello as free people. But how do you handle these kinds of things? That's one of the things that I sort of grapple with in the book. And it's a subject now that I have a feeling Monticello is going to be dealing with quite a bit now that they have decided to do the room and will actually have people there talking about this particular subject and interpreting her. People will be forced to think about her as a person. So the second part of the book, really, after I get through talking about Elizabeth Hemings and setting things up, the second section of the book is really about Sally Hemings and the beginning of this connection, relationship, liaison, whatever it is we're going to call it, with Jefferson. And then the third part of the book really tries to do what I said I originally was going to do, and that is branch out and talk about other members of the Hemings family as much as possible. If you've been to Monticello, you know the story of John Hemings. John Hemings was the master carpenter at Monticello, and he's responsible for some of the furniture there that's on display even now. He did the floors, he did the roof at Poplar Forest for Jefferson. He was also a surrogate father of sorts to Jefferson's sons, Beverly, Madison, and Hemings. They were put under the tutelage of John Hemings to learn how to become carpenters. And one of the things that I won't say discovered, because I knew it when I was writing my first book, but I didn't make anything of it because, as I said, I wasn't really thinking about the story of the Hemingses in the same way. Jefferson had a retreat, Poplar Forest, that he took to going to in his retirement, because when he retired, it seemed like the world descended on him at Monticello and stayed for weeks at a time. And instead of saying, you should go, he left. He left it to them. I'm leaving it to you. And so he would go to Poplar Forest and stay a lot of for long periods of time. And there were a series of letters where he writes to his overseer at Poplar Forest, and he says, I'm coming to Poplar Forest, or I will be arriving on such and such date. I'm bringing Johnny Hemings and his 2 assistants, or Johnny Hemings and his apprentices. He doesn't use their names, but his apprentices and his assistants are either, Beverly, Madison, and Eston. So he is coming with, and he says the rest of the carpenters will come another day. So he's traveling with these boys, because they're boys at this time, and then young men, to go out to Poplar Forest and spending large amounts of time. If you've ever been to Poplar Forest, it's not a big place. So he's around them quite a bit, and I hadn't really thought about that much, because you think of him, Madison Hemings in his recollection says that Jefferson was uniformly kind to everyone and to them, but he was not in the habit of showing them partiality or fatherly affection. So you read that and you sort of think that he's, distant. I mean, I thought of sort of physical distance. But these letters suggest that they are together quite a bit. These young men actually would have known Jefferson very well, because they spent a good amount of time with him in his retirement. So that kind of gave me a different window, too, into Jefferson and into the lives of the Hemings family, and how these connections actually, in some ways, benefited other members of the family, the collateral members of the family. There's a story about another James Hemings, not the chef James Hemings, but his nephew, because they named their children after one another, too, who gets beat by Jefferson's overseer, and he runs away. runs away to Richmond. Jefferson sends somebody to find him, and once he finds him, he's found, he tells him to come back. And Jamie says, I'm not coming back unless you promise me that I can work with John Hemmings, that I don't have to go back and work under the overseer who had beat him, because Jefferson's artisans were not under the control of the overseer. They answered to Jefferson, not to the overseer. And Jefferson says, okay, you can, you come back, you can work with John Hemmings. And then Jamie decides he doesn't want to come back at all. And he just doesn't come back. And Jefferson takes him off the slave rolls. He essentially lets him go. Now, James Hemmings, this Jamie is Sally Hemings's nephew. It's his wife's half-nephew. He's John Wells's grandson. That connection meant something. If James Hemmings had been, was James Hubbard, who was another enslaved man at Monticello who ran away, and Jefferson had him brought back, and he kept running away, and Jefferson would come back, and he would bring him back, and Jefferson actually had him whipped and sold because he kept running away. So see the difference between James Hubbard, who has no family connection to Jefferson, and James Hemmings, who has all of these family connections, and when he runs away, he tells Jefferson, I'm not coming back. And Jefferson says, well, I'm not coming back unless you put me under, he issues basically a condition, and Jefferson abides by it, goes along with it. And then when he runs away and doesn't come back at all, Jefferson just lets him go. And he appears in other records. Jefferson is paying him later on to be, to get some instruments from him, or some scientific instruments from him for Richmond. Years later. So he has contact with the family, he's just off the slave rolls. Well, that could only happen because of a family connection. Jefferson wouldn't take that, wouldn't accept that from another enslaved person. So this connection that, to my mind, when I'm thinking about it, looking at my first book, that just seemed, what is the purpose of this? Why would she come back? What purpose would it serve to do that? You kind of wonder if there was not some sense that that was probably the best deal that she might be able to get in life, and she would be with her family. Not necessarily coming back for him, but coming back to the United States as a way of being with family, and in some ways having a connection that protected her family in some fashion. We'll never know the answer to this, as I said, because we don't have Sally Hemings's letters. But looking at the family, look at the things that happened to them, there is a story about this, there's a way of thinking about this that I did not really, it didn't really make as much sense, it didn't make much sense to me when I was thinking about it the first time. Now, the story ends not very well, because Jefferson dies bankrupt in 1826. He has to sell, things are sold to pay the debts. Enslaved people are sold, some of them are bought back. It's a very, very murky kind of situation. But some members of the Hemmings family end up on the auction block. And I end the story of the Hemmings is not talking about Sally Hemings and her children, but talking about a man named Peter Fawcett. Oh, he's not a man at the time, he's a little boy who's sold away from his family. And it takes many, many years before they are reunited. Peter Fawcett ends up in Ohio as a minister and as a prominent caterer. And he does get reunited with his family after many, many years. He's able to buy his freedom. And I end with that story because it shows you the sort of tenuous nature of this notion of privilege. Peter Fawcett was the grandson of Mary Hemings, the person who was living on Main Street with Thomas Bell, the white man. And he described his life as a little boy as privileged. But the real shock to him was when he was sold, when the thing that slavery was about came brutally to his reality. Profit, property, people as property who could be bought and sold. And that was a thing that many members of the Hemings family, despite whatever privilege Sally Hemings and her children might have had, they all lived with the specter of the possibility that that could happen because the law construed them as property, and Jefferson construed them as property. And that's the difficulty that we have in thinking about him in relation to this family, and thinking about Jefferson as a person. We can talk about that in the question and answer period. What do you make of this situation? The Hemingses are seen as privileged members of people who lived on the mountain, of enslaved people on the mountain, but they were enslaved. They couldn't leave, despite their talents, despite their capabilities, they were still legal property. And however Jefferson treated them, however better he treated them, that was the reality that shaped their lives. And that's the message that I got most forcefully in thinking about this family and writing about them and spending so much time with them, is to think about the precarious nature of their lives, even under the power of a person who thought of himself as benevolent. So with that, I'm finished. The question and answer period is always the best one. So.
And we have plenty of time, so I'm actually going to start here tonight, come over to you, and then I'll be working across room with Kelly as well.
It's difficult for me to stand, so. You mentioned that Sally was 14 when she joined Jefferson in Paris. Mm-hmm. How old was Jefferson?
Jefferson was 30 years older than she, so he's 44. Yes, it's quite an age span. That's one thing. I did a talk before, like a middle school students, and people came to ask me to come to talk to them about it. And I thought, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this to talk to middle school students? And of course, I shouldn't have worried, because I got there and people said, well, the kids said, I don't know why they're calling this an affair. An affair is when you are having, sex with somebody other than your husband or wife. And I went, yeah, that's right. They're actually quite knowledgeable people. And then I said, well, and then they said, well, I said, well, what's the big deal here? He said, if he's their master, he can do what he wants. And I said, yes, that's right, that's true. And he said, why do people not see that? And I said, well, they have difficulty with it because they don't like the idea of Jefferson, doing this. And they said, well, what are the problems? And I mentioned, well, they were not the same race, and so that bothered people, and that didn't really get to them. And then one young girl raised her hand, and she said, how old was she? And I said, well, she had her first baby when she was 17. So she was probably about 16 years old. You could think the only evidence of the beginning of sexual activity is that she had a baby when she was 17. When I mentioned she would have been about 16 years old, they went, oh. Because they began to look at how old they were and count it up and think about it. The racial thing really didn't get to them. The power story didn't really get to them. It was the age thing that gave them pause. But the age of consent in Virginia during this time period was 12. And it was raised, no, it was 10 actually, and then it was raised to 12 in the 1820s. Sally Hemings, a 16-year-old or 15-year-old girl would not have been thought of the way we think of a 15. That's a baby. It's a baby. Kids are, we've prolonged childhood, now to 35, I don't know. Whatever, it's sort of gone on. It's sort of dragging this out quite a bit. But then it wouldn't have been. But still, I'm writing this. At the time that I was writing this, I had a teenage daughter, and I'm like, you're pulling your hair out just thinking about this. But that's not how they would have thought about this situation.
Yes, as a follow-up, do you have some sense, you've brought to light something I was totally unaware of, this age aspect. You said, his manservant was someone who was 14, I think you said. So is there a sense that Jefferson liked surrounding himself at that stage in his life with people who were so young as a way to sort of be a father figure, or for some other reason to have young people around him that he could easily converse with or talk to or have an interplay with?
Well, I think Robert is brought in because he married Robert's. I would, again, this is the novelistic, the novelist, the fake, the wannabe novelist coming out. I think he probably made Robert his manservant as a show of solidarity with his wife. This is his wife's half brother. I wonder about Martha, because Robert and James, we don't know if Sally, Robert and James could read and write. And they could evidently read and write as young people. And I wonder who taught them how to read and write. It's possible that Martha could have done that. I think I could see the hand of Martha in this. This is totally speculative, and you would put this in a historical novel. I don't put this in the, you don't have any way of proving this. But I think Robert is attached to Jefferson because he's married Robert's sister. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, these relationships. The other historians would write about the Hemingses in the past and would not, they'd say James or a slave. They might use their name or not, but I think it's important to keep that relationship in mind. Robert is Jefferson's wife's half-brother. And what better way for him to get education, to get, to see the world, to see other things, than to be hanging out with Jefferson. So I don't know that I don't think he's picking him because he's young. I think he's picking him because of his connection to his wife, who evidently wanted her half-siblings in her household, and to sort of give out goods and favors to those particular people as opposed to others.
Yes, it seems to me that you have tacitly assumed that Jefferson is the father of her children, but you never said so. As I understand it, he had brothers or brother who possibly, and I'm not sure about DNA. Does DNA say Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, or someone else? So,
no, DNA does not say. That's why I said the DNA supported what I said. It didn't. It's not a paternity test. The reason I believe that it's Jefferson is not just the DNA. It's other information that I compiled in my first book, and it's the totality of the circumstances. And the brother has no written connection to Sally Hemings. You can't, that's not historical to say, if you have a situation where Jefferson's friends are writing about it in their diary, people who visit Monticello are writing about it in his letters, the names of the children, they're all named for his best friends and favored relatives. So it's the kind of thing that a genealogist would do. You look at the totality of the circumstances, and then you put the DNA on it. When the family had, the family basically, the Jefferson family, basically made up a story about who was the father of the children, and the DNA killed that. So if they would have known that if it was Jefferson's brother, they would have known that, and they would have picked him. But they didn't know that there would come a day when you could differentiate between maternal relatives and paternal relatives. They picked the wrong relative, and that's what the DNA says. So no, the DNA test is not a paternity test, but it's the DNA and other information that has been compiled, and that's what historians do. I mean, you compile information. And so, that's my conclusion, and that's the Foundation's conclusion at Monticello, and that's the story that they tell now.
I want to thank you for your scholarship. You've enriched our lives and our depth of understanding of our history. I was a student at Charlottesville when you were working out, and my older professor saw your ideas. But it's wonderful to have you at Fredericksburg today. Would you care to comment on the recent controversy in Charlottesville about quoting Jefferson?
About what?
The witness of quoting Jefferson.
Oh, the president of the University of Virginia ought to be able to quote Jefferson when it's appropriate. I mean, he's, I don't, the caveat is this. If it's, every time there's alternate side parking or there's some kind of missive that doesn't really have anything to do with it, if you have to bring Jefferson into it, it's whatever day, and so Jefferson would have said blah, blah, blah. I don't think that. But Jefferson said a lot of things that were terrible, but Jefferson said a lot of things that were wonderful. And if it's appropriate to use his words, I think they ought to be used. He was the founder of the University of Virginia. You can't pretend that didn't happen. So, yeah, I think Jefferson ought to be, you can quote Jefferson when it's an appropriate thing to do. I don't know, maybe people who at UVA are getting tired, as I said, if it's some sort of rote thing that you're doing for no reason, but you can't get rid of Jefferson. I mean, you can't. There are things that you have to live with, and you deal with the problems, the flaws, you deal with the good points and the bad points, but he's not, people ask me about this, all the time. And, he's not John Calhoun, right? Not John, there's a difference between a person who, helped found the United States of America and a person whose ideology helped people think that they should destroy the United States of America. That's a different type of person altogether. So I think we're stuck with him. We got the Declaration of Independence, the Library of Congress, you have West Point, you have the Jefferson Grid, you have just on and on and on. He sort of injected himself into all aspects of life, and you just have to deal with that. And I think it's a good thing to deal with it because it helps you talk about the most difficult aspects of American life, the best and the worst. I say in the book that it's fitting to talk about this story because Monticello is where we've been the best and the worst in one spot, through one person. And so yes, President Sullivan should quote Jefferson when it's appropriate. If it's not just to throw it out there just for no reason, but she wouldn't do that. So presumably she's doing this for a reason. And you can't take him out of the university. Use it to talk. Calhoun was not worth it. I talked to people at Yale about this when they were trying to decide what to do. He didn't occupy the same space at Yale that Jefferson occupies at Virginia. So we could do without him, and they will do without Calhoun. They have another name for it, but the university is Jefferson's university.
Do you know where the Hemmings name came from with regard to this family?
No, I don't. We don't. I've tried to figure that out. That was one of the things that I was, that I tried to see if there was sort of English antecedents to it. There are Hemmingses in England, but no. The captain who is supposed to be, Captain Hemmings, they mention him, but I don't know where he came from. The antecedent is the captain, the person who was the father of Elizabeth, but I don't know where. I don't know anything beyond that. I don't know his first name, so it's difficult to track down if you don't have a first name. There are Hemmingses, but I haven't been able to make the connection beyond just the Captain Hemmings.
Well, the gentleman took my first question, so here's the second.
Where are you? Oh, there. This disembodied voice. There you are.
On my last trip to Monticello, the docent there mentioned that upon Jefferson's death, that three of Sally's children were put in a carriage and driven to D.C. and released without papers, assuming that...
They told you that?
Someone told me that.
A docent told you that? We have to talk to them. Go ahead.
Well, the assumption was that they were so fair-skinned that they could just blend into the population. Is that true?
It's sort of a mix of stories that's mixed up here. The eldest son, Beverly Hemmings, her eldest son, Beverly Hemmings, and Harriet left Monticello to live as white people. Jefferson put Harriet on a stagecoach, gave her money, and sent her away from Monticello. He says in his farm book that they ran away, but they left to go live as white people. Beverly left a couple of months before Harriet, and the thinking is, he went to prepare, instead of sitting her by herself, or off by herself, he left 2 months earlier. Then Jefferson puts Harriet on the stagecoach, or has his overseer do it, gives her money, and sends her away. They went to live as white people. We don't know what happened to them because of that. Madison Hemmings says that Beverly married a woman in good circumstances in Washington and had a daughter. She said Harriet married a man, and a man who was well off as well, and had children, multiple children, but they did not associate with the family after a particular time, because when you pass into the white world, you can't keep going to see your, relatives who are not passing. Beverly is described at one point as having ascended a hot air balloon in Petersburg. I tried tracking that down. I found a record of a balloon ascension during the time, in the 1830s, but I haven't been able to find anything else about him. I'm doing a second volume of the Hemmings family story, so I'm going to try to figure that one out. People periodically appear claiming to be the descendants of Beverly and Harriet, but we haven't been able to confirm that. So the two eldest leave. They don't want papers, because if they have papers, people know that they were enslaved. And if they were enslaved, that means they're part black, and they couldn't live as white people. They were actually, by Virginia law, white. The law in Virginia at that time was that if you were 7/8 white, you were white. The one-drop rule is a product of the 20th century. So technically, they were white people, but the difference between technical whiteness and actual whiteness, if people had known, it would have been, a problem for them. So the two eldest live as white people. The two youngest are freed in Jefferson's will, and they stay with their mother until she dies. And then they leave and go to Ohio. The youngest one, Eston, at some point, finds it really difficult for his family in Chillicothe, Ohio, where they had settled. And there are stories written about him because he made his living as a violinist in Ohio. And there are stories about his daughter's piano recitals and so forth. But Ohio began to crack down on blacks, and he at some point decides to take his family, and he moves to Madison, Wisconsin. He changes his name from Eston Hemmings to Eston Hemmings Jefferson, or E.H. Jefferson, and the children change their names to Jefferson, and they live as white people. And they tell a story that when people ask them, are you related to Jefferson, they say, oh, we're related to a Jefferson uncle, or Jefferson, so a collateral, because everybody knew that Jefferson had no legitimate white sons. So that's their family story. For 2 generations, they keep the story of Hemmings and Jefferson, but the grandchildren, because they want to be white, they don't tell them about that. And they lose the story of Sally Hemings, and they lose the story of Thomas Jefferson, too. It's better than being a descendant of Thomas Jefferson if you're part black. It's better to forget that than to, live as a black person with all the limitations that would be on you. So that family loses its story, and it is that family line that gave the DNA for the testing that was done in 2008. They had not known, 1998. They didn't know until the 70s. They had a son who kept trying to do his family history, and they were a long line of Princeton graduates, and he couldn't get past a certain point. And it wasn't until Fawn Brodie wrote her book and had Madison Hemings' recollections in the back of them that they realized Eston. They had thought his name was Esty, and they couldn't figure this out. That's when they realized that there was a connection. So Madison Hemings was the only one whose family remained in the black community, although some of his children passed into whiteness as well. So the story is partly true. Beverly and Harriet leave before Jefferson dies. So it's not upon his death that they get put in the stagecoach. Only one is in the stagecoach. Harriet is in the stagecoach. This is in 1822, before Jefferson dies. And the two youngest children are freed in his will, stay in Charlottesville a time, and then go off to Ohio.
And we've got time for one more over here.
Doctor, thanks so much for your research. Do we have any knowledge, I'm over here, do we have any knowledge of the relationship between the Hemingses and the rest of the slaves on Monticello? Was there a lot of resentment with the other house slaves or the field slaves about the special, unique relationship, or did they know of it, or were they aware of it?
Well, it's interesting because the people who have done that last point that you're making, did they know of it? The people who are doing this project at Monticello called Getting Word, where they're talking to all the people who were descendants of people enslaved at Monticello, say that the Hemings story actually was vivid to people who were not members of the Hemings family, and it was a reason to remember Monticello. So even when they're talking to people in a different family, descendants, they knew this story and talked about it. So it was something that people knew, and it was something that Jefferson's neighbors knew, because they talk about it. Look at they're talking about it in their letters. Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, said that it was a source of bitter jealousy, that he claimed that the other people down the mountain, other non-Hemings people, were jealous of the Hemingses. Well, that's because they were so close to the Jeffersons. Well, that was just his interpretation. It could well have been that they thought that the Hemingses were co-opted. Of course, Jeff Randolph would think, they're jealous because these people get to hang around us. That probably was not the answer. They probably didn't want to hang around with him. It could have been that they thought, who do you think, they might have been resentful and not jealous of them, but saying, who do you think you are, essentially? You have been co-opted by these people. So that's the only hint of any kind of enmity that might be between them. But the other indications is that people did cooperate. There's no reason to think that they actually hated them. But the only comment that we have about this comes from Jeff Randolph, and you really do have to be careful in looking at the words of, the family, the legal family who owns these people, to take their word for what is going on there and their interpretation of it. There's no reason to think beyond that they loved or hated members of the Hemings family.
Well, I'm sure we could ask questions all night of Dr. Gordon Reed on this subject that is never less than fascinating and controversial. So before we say goodnight and thank her, I want to remind everybody that Dr. Gordon Reed will be signing copies of her book in the lobby. There will also be copies of Courtney's parting gift by our local historian available for there. And I also want to thank Dr. Crawley for making this an exceptionally awesome year for me, my first year here at Mary Washington. So thank you very much for that. And please help me thank Annette Gordon Reed.
the story about whether or not Thomas Jefferson had had children with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, who lived on his plantation, Monticello. I was concerned about the practice of listening to the stories of the white family, the legal white family, upper class people, and dismissing the story of enslaved people who talked about their life in slavery, about something that was, as we know now, from the family stories of African Americans, and as we know now from DNA testing. I'm not talking about Hemings testing, but testing that population geneticists have done on African Americans across the country, and it pretty shows very much that the kind of mixing that was going on at Monticello was going on across the South. And this was not something that was rare, and it was not something that people talked about in their letters, but we could see it visibly in the faces and the bodies and the contour, the hair of African Americans all over the United States. So I was concerned about the way of dismissing the story of African Americans and crediting the story of the legal family. And after my book came out in 1997 and the DNA testing followed in 1998.
Earlier, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Gordon Reed here. For no one knows the public and private Jefferson quite as well as she does. The story of the relationship between our third president and his own slave is one she first explored back in 1997 with her book Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. She came to the subject again more than a decade later with her 2009 book, The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, which won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize for History. And it's this book and this subject that bring us together tonight. And it's an important topic, and for some, an uncomfortable topic, to be sure. As the historian Joseph Ellis said, quote, Thomas Jefferson is often described his slaves at Monticello as my family. Annette Gordon Reed has taken that description seriously. Surely more than Jefferson ever intended. It is not a pretty story, but it is poignant beyond belief. It is indeed, and it is also wonderfully and touchingly told. But then those of us who know her and her work would expect nothing less. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to Great Lives, the wonderful Annette Gordon Reed.
That corroborated, supported what it was that I was suggesting in my first book. It occurred to me that one of the reasons that it was easy to dismiss the story of the Hemings family was because people didn't know anything about the Hemings family, other than that there was a scandal, and they knew the name Sally Hemings, and they may have known the name James Hemings of her brother, who was the chef. But by and large, people didn't know that much about the family. And I was thinking that if I could tell their story in a way that made people feel that they had a stake in them, that it might give people pause in the future about dismissing the story of enslaved people. I live in Manhattan, and I live partly in Manhattan, partly in Cambridge. But when I'm in Manhattan, it's a big city, crowded city, and sort of an anonymous city. But when you meet somebody, if I meet somebody in the neighborhood, I immediately begin to see them after that. You know, when you're introduced to someone, you see them all the time. You've been walking past them before, but you didn't know them. Once you begin to know them, you notice their children, you notice when you don't see them where you expect to see them. They become a part of you in a way. You have a stake in them, and that's what I wanted to do. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I was in Charlottesville earlier today for the presentation of the Thomas Jefferson medals. One of my dear friends, Loretta Lynch, the former Attorney General, received the Medal for Law, and so I stopped off in Charlottesville to be able to see that and sat in that wonderful building, the Rotunda, that has been redone and is absolutely beautiful. And then I got in a car and I came here to be with you today, and I'm very, very happy to be here on a beautiful day, spring day, and been able to enjoy the hospitality of people here and the beautiful, beautiful campus. This is interesting for me because I'm sort of in the middle of a book tour with my co-author, Peter Onuf, who helped me write Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. And we've been going around together, so flying solo is interesting. I was used to doing it before, but I've gotten used to having him here. But tonight is a Hemings story night, and I'm glad to talk to you about this. My first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, I thought was really about historians, about the way people wrote history, and particularly the way historians had handled
Wow. So it is perhaps appropriate that on Thomas Jefferson's birthday, we bring to you one of our most prestigious speakers and one of Jefferson's cleverest biographers. Professor Annette Gordon-Reed is the one who definitively cracked the case, as our speaker on Tuesday might have said, on one of American history's most complex and now expunged, until now, expunged stories, which is the relationship between the Jeffersons and the Hemingses. Professor Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and a Professor of History in the Faculty of Arts and Science at Harvard University. She has a jaw-dropping list of honors. I will read you a few. A fellowship from the Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a MacArthur Fellowship, the National Humanities Medal, and the Woman of Power and Influence Award from the National Organization for Women in New York City. She's written extensively on both seen and unseen Americans, including a biography of Andrew Johnson, and her most recent book, out in paperback today, is Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. So when it comes to Jefferson, as I said